It's been in the news quite a bit this year, as they have the first commercially available blood test for Alzheimer's disease. And she leads the development of diagnostics for neurodegenerative diseases in multiple areas, including scientific oversight, business development, and scientific communications. She's overseen the C2N clinical lab accreditation and successfully led the transformation of the lab from R&D to CLIA certified. We also have Professor Laurie Parker, who is an associate professor of biochemistry, molecular biology, and biophysics, and is the associate dean for undergraduate education in the College of Biological Sciences at the University of Minnesota. And she has experienced firsthand some of the ups and downs of being involved in a startup, which is Kinesense, that grew out of her research program, developing kinase assays using chemical biology and proteomics. And she has some really great perspectives on what worked in that adventure and what didn't. And then we have Dr. Megan Aanstoos, who is a licensing and new ventures manager for Kentucky Commercialization Ventures. Here she is responsible for outreach and education on matters related to commercialization, along with assessing, managing, and licensing intellectual property developed at and fostering collaborations between partner institutions and third-party collaborators. And so, as a lot of us are either in academia or have spent a lot of time in academia, I thought it would be really great if Megan gave a little kickoff with some slides about the technology transfer process and how you really even just start out with beginning a startup and seeing that form into a company, and what some of the metrics are in terms of gender disparity there.
All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. These slides are going to be pretty brief, but hopefully lead to some questions. So, as Susan mentioned, I am a licensing and startup manager, and I came out of academia because I found it really hard to be in the lab. I did animal research for my PhD and my postdoc, and I felt like I'd be better served if I was able to help make connections rather than not getting sleep because I was worried that my mice wouldn't survive the night. I go by she, her, and I have a PhD in biomedical engineering with a focus in orthopedic oncology. And my mission is to help create inclusive environments for innovators and communities to succeed. And at the current moment, I am a tech transfer or knowledge exchange licensing startup professional with the Kentucky Commercialization Ventures. And so what we're doing here in Kentucky is helping to address a lack of tech transfer support for our regional and typically rural institutions of higher education. And the reason that we do this is because we support EDI measures at the state and federal level, along with many of our partners. And we encourage our institutions to increase their inclusivity measures and to remove barriers for innovators. And a lot of times, those innovators that we need to remove barriers for are women, people of color, people from rural areas, people from low socioeconomic statuses, people with disabilities, and even veterans. And so through partnerships within the state, we've created new opportunities for these minority-serving institutions to access funding and support commercialization of their research. And what does that mean, commercialization? So that means that we start with an idea, and it's the process of bringing those ideas to market for financial gain or impact. So an idea becomes an innovation when you put it into a form that the market can consume. And some of these outcomes can include cures or solutions. So as you heard, Dr. Hugh and her team have created a way to address Alzheimer's. They address an unmet need. They can be tools or surveys. And what we can do with these kind of things is create startup companies like you heard from Dr. Parker. We can also have partnerships with academia or with industry, and a multitude of other things that can happen when you share your ideas in a good, safe fashion. So what is the legal basis for the intellectual property? It actually comes from the Constitution in the United States, and that's reflected across many other countries around the world. And in our country of the United States, it says that Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and the use for arts by securing to a limited time authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So basically what it's saying is all the time and the turmoil and the cost that we put into our inventions, we have the right to exclude others from using them so that we can recoup some of those costs. And then essentially 4 different types of intellectual property that can be protected. Trade secrets, and this is a method of doing business or a technical know-how that gives the holder a competitive advantage. And a good example of this is the formula for Coca-Cola, which has been held as a trade secret for over 120 years now. Patents, and most of us, when we think of intellectual property, we think of patents. And this is a grant issued by the federal government. So in the United States, it's the USPTO, which gives an assignee that exclusive right to exclude others. And those exclusions allow you to then take the opportunity to market. A copyright, which is a right that protects an original work of authorship fixed in a tangible medium of expression. And a lot of times today, it comes down to software. So if you write code and you put that code up on GitHub and you release it to the world, make sure you put a copyright tag on that before you do that, because that's your copyright. And then finally, marks. And most commonly, we hear that referred to as trademarks, but it can also be service marks. It can even be scent marks or sound marks. And these are non-functional words, logos, etc. that distinguish a product or a service. So for example, if you're walking through the mall and someone spritz perfume and you get that scent of Chanel No. 5, you know that perfume because Chanel No. 5 has a scent mark on that particular odor. So when we talk about these types of things, you can put them together in a different combination, and they allow you to put a fence around what you're doing and allow you to take that opportunity to market. So why do you care about it as an innovator? Because, you know, a lot of us say, well, we just want to help the world. We just want to get our inventions out there so that other people can feel the benefit that we know we can do for them. But as an inventor, you need to be able to do more than just publish your research. Publishing it alone, a lot of companies don't want to invest in that because you're not quite at the stage yet where it's really going to help people. And they need to have that exclusivity in order to invest the money into there to get it to the point where the market can benefit. So there's an increased opportunity for protection and for funding. You might want to go after an SBIR, STTR, and that's a small business innovation grant that comes from the federal government. And it gives you an opportunity to develop your technology. You might want to look into venture capital investments or getting small business loans. You might want to get translational funding from NIH or NSF. Partnerships are really important with intellectual property. A lot of companies don't want to enter into a partnership agreement unless they have an option for that exclusivity. There's also public brand awareness. So if you're creating something, there's a value if you say that this thing that you created comes from, for example, Thermo Fisher, as opposed to the person in their garage down the street. And there's also collaborations that can occur and result in new funding and new ideas. And finally, you have mergers and acquisitions. So we hear about, for example, how Facebook bought WhatsApp. So WhatsApp used to be an independent group, right? It was an app that somebody created and put out there. And Facebook saw the value in that, and they had intellectual property, and Facebook acquired it. We also look at market gain. So the ability to exclude others on the market and to protect your reputation and your brand as you move forward with it. And finally, and the thing I think is most important, is to influence the world with your research by having an impact on what you've done. We don't toil away in the lab because it's all fun and games. We don't bring the next generation up just because that's the thing to do. We do it because we want to change the world. We want to help people and make it a better place to live. But you know what? Most of the people who are doing that, they're not women. I want you all to take a moment in the chat, raise your hand, unmute yourself, name an invention who was created from a woman inventor, or name a woman inventor themselves.
The woman who invented the hangers, I think she was, there's a movie about her. she mentioned a lot of things. Remember that? I'm blanking on
Joy.
her. Yeah, Joy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, name another one.
Rita Hayworth famously had patent on like radio technology in World War II.
Name a third.
Wasn't that Hedy Lamarr? Not Rita Hayworth?
Oh,
But
I
yes.
think you're right. Oh,
But yes.
Is Madam C.J. Walker considered an inventor when she created like hair products?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, great options. And Ariel mentioned CRISPR, right? So that's Jennifer Judah. So how long did that take us to do, right? Now, if I say name an inventor and I don't specify the gender, how many of you are going to think of those people first? Or how many are going to say something like Albert Einstein or George Washington Carver or Thomas Edison? Because a lot of times our minds don't go to women. They go to men, especially white men. And a lot of women in STEM, particularly young women, feel like they don't belong. They have to justify themselves. They have to justify their qualifications. No, really, I do have that PhD. And look, I even got it from a university that's an O1, right? I belong here. I deserve to be here. You should count me amongst everyone. But don't feel like you have to do that, because you do deserve to be here. And the work you do is just as valuable. Women and other marginalized inventors, if we are able to include them at the same rates as white male inventors in the United States alone, we would quadruple the amount of innovation that takes place. It would be trillions of dollars added to the economic impact in this country every year if we were not held back by discrimination or systemic barriers. Women make up about half of the STEM bachelor degrees that are received in this country right now, and about 25% of the STEM degrees and PhDs. But they account for just under 13% of patent applications globally. Here in the United States, it's slightly higher at 21% that had one woman on them. But when we look at the number of all women teams, it dropped down to 0.3%. Gender parity won't be reached until at least 2070. Some estimates go as high as 2200. And it heavily depends on the field. In biotechnology, which is a field most of us are in, 53% of patents name are women. It drops down to less than 10% when you look at electrical engineering. We in the tech transfer community are concerned about these numbers. And so we started measuring them ourselves. And the Autumn survey, Autumn is formerly known as the Association of University Technology Managers, and now we're a tech transfer professional group across the United States with a global impact. And the Women's Inventors Special Interest Groups has a metric subcommittee that is dedicated to asking these questions. And it's been asking these questions now since 2015. And amongst 176 institutions that have responded to the question, what percentage of women are on an invention disclosure? 32% of women are on one of these disclosures. And when it comes to patent filings, new patent filings, 22% include at least one woman. And when you look at those numbers, that's over the course of a 3 to 5 year period that we see that. So I call out, you know, we earlier heard most of us are academics. Doing these numbers, go increase them. You can do it because so many others have done it too. We looked at some of the other women inventors we heard earlier. Here's some more. Dr. Marion Rogers-Croak. You may have heard of her. She's incredibly famous. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation today if it wasn't for the work she did. Dr. Eleanor Taka. She was the first Hispanic woman in space, and she co-invented a whole bunch of things that included her ability to do that. Dr. Hedy Lamarr, we heard about her. She was a movie star. You don't have to be someone who came from something. You don't have to be formally trained in order to create and invent things. And Helen Murray-Free, she and her husband first created the dip and read test that we do now for things like dialysis. And amongst all these other women are all the people who haven't had the opportunity to get out into the world. As an example, how many of you have traveled in the last, let's say, 5 years now, right? And how many of you have used a rolling suitcase?
I think we are frozen, aren't we? Well, there we go.
I think Megan. There you are. Megan, are you back?
I'm back. I'm sorry
good.
about that.
No worries.
All right. So let's keep going here. So, you know, we have a whole host of things that have been created by women. Some of them more practical, like the dishwasher. Some of them a little bit more esoteric, like a brand new computer language from Grace Hopper. So what are your next steps? What are the things you can do? Well, it starts with finding your supporters. Your knowledge exchange or tech transfer offices exist in many academic institutions, and we're here to help. We want to hear your ideas. We want to help you to guide those to fruition. If you're maybe not somebody who's engaged with a company or engaged with the academic center that has a tech transfer office, well, good thing that there are patent offices in pretty much every country around the world. The United States Patent and Trademark Office, the World International Patent Office, the European Patent Office, Japan, China, Singapore, Australia, all of these countries have patent offices, and within them, they have options for help. They have pro bono support to get your patents to market. They have ways to help you to easily and cheaply file your provisional patents so that you can start assessing whether people want your technology. And don't be afraid to ask for help. That's one of the things that I see a lot with women, is that we tend to hold back. We don't want to be a bother. We don't want to burden someone. Obviously, what we've done is not good enough, so we're not going to ask for help. But don't let excuses hold you back. Instead, take a moment to say, you know what, I've done something. And that's something I've done, I think it can help other people. And the only way it's going to help other people is if you take a moment and actually protect it. So that's all I have for my presentation. I will turn it over to my co-presenters here and also take a moment for questions if anybody has any.
So I guess I
Thank
have
you,
a question.
Megan. That was great. Oh, go ahead, Erin.
Yeah, I guess I have a question. Thank you so much, Megan. That was awesome. I think it was like the kick in the butt sometimes we need to hear, because there are a lot of times where we sit back and it's like, oh, my idea can't be as good as somebody else's, and I shouldn't bother somebody about even asking about it. I guess the one I always get confused with is software, because for me, something more tangible than software is easier. So what advice do you have for commercializing, like you said, code, like trademarking code or that kind of thing?
Yeah, definitely. And software is tricky. So software is tricky for everyone, including the USPTO, who is continuously every year getting an update on what they're supposed to do with software. And so when we talk about software, I really divide it into a couple of categories. So one is the actual code itself. And the code itself is copyrightable. That's what you put in a tangible medium, and it tells people what to do, right? So that might be Java, that might be Python, it might be Squall, etc. And then we have an algorithm. And an algorithm is a computer way of telling a method of something. So if you have a method of making XYZ happen, but you do that through a computer algorithm, then that might be patentable. So when you're dealing with software, you might have copyright, you might have patent, you might have both. And I think it's really important, and I ran into this with a female inventor when I worked at Ohio State University. And she thought she didn't have anything because she kept saying, well, I have a computer code that tells me how to do this. And unfortunately, the person she was working with said, well, that may be copyrightable. But really what she had was a method of doing something, a system of doing something, and that's patentable. And so when language is so important, when you're talking about your inventions, make sure you really take a moment to explain what you're doing and use words like method or system or analysis if what you truly have is an algorithm. And an algorithm is something, right, as we look into the AI era or the ML era, which is something that doesn't require exactly following your code. Your computer can do something without you having to tell it to do that in that exact line. And that makes a difference, because a patent is something that is beyond just reading words on a page. And so a patent has to be useful. It has to be non-obvious. It has to be novel. And by putting in a patent application, you have to enable other people to do it.
Yeah, that helps a lot.
That's maybe that's a good segue for me to talk a little bit about what my experiences were, because that's essentially the kind of patent that we ended up getting at first. We had figured out this way of taking phosphorylation preference data and cross-referencing motifs against each other, and then generating potential sequences and filtering those lists in a certain way to get fluorescent readout from the peptides that would result from that. And that's kind of what our patent is, and as a method. And then that was what the basis of the startup company was that came out of my lab. And there were some pluses and minuses to that for us. So one of the advantages was that then, so we have this process that was sort of attractive to potential interest, because it meant we could then make an assay for any kinase that some company was interested in. But then also it meant that we had to separately protect every single one of the sequences that we then make out of that, and that becomes just logistically expensive for our tech transfer folks for that office. So it's kind of ended up in some ways being a difficulty for us. But so as a startup company that came out of this, the student who developed it was actually not the inventor on this. He was a student who was working on other things. And that ended up, again, also being sort of weirdly pro and con. So, he'd gotten a fellowship to do tech transfer training, and he was really interested in it. So he had the drive to pick it up after he graduated with his PhD and like build it forward. But the problem was, and I'm going to shut my door because there's dishes happening in my house downstairs. The problem was then he didn't have quite the same fundamental understanding of how it worked and what it could do. And that is what ended up in the long term resulting in some of it being oversold, and therefore not as like able to do the kinds of things that the people who were interested in investing in thought it could do. So then they would find out later, like, actually it can't do that thing. So maybe we're not so interested in it. And but like the steps along the way worked better having him do it, maybe because he could sort of get that like higher level explanation of here's this thing, rather than I would get really caught in the weeds. Yeah, the student who had been the algorithm inventor would get really caught in the weeds. He'd be like, and it would just see people's eyes tune out, like too much detail. So that was a good thing. If there's someone who understands enough of it that they can do that and they have that communication style, that's probably a really great way to set up a partnership for a startup. But in our case, also just kind of what we were doing was not ready for prime time yet. And the business that it really was for would be like contract research organizations who are doing kinase screening for other people who have libraries of inhibitors. And that's a really, really small market, very small, niche focused, and also not the kind of market that will necessarily like license something. Those companies usually will develop an assay in-house and they've got their assay that they do. So we always struggled. We ended up with some struggles like that. He successfully got some funding from Indiana because this was started when I was at Purdue. He also successfully got some SBIR funding, some phase 1 funding, and he got a sort of small contract from GSK to do some development towards some kinases they were interested in. And so for a few years, it kind of like floated along, doing some things and learning some stuff and making some progress, but then hit the wall at the phase 2 stage of SBIR, which is the one where you're actually like getting enough money to go somewhere with stuff. And a lot of that was because we just had these weaknesses in the commercialization plan area. It's like we have this niche market. If we could use our assay to measure kinase activity in like patient blood for a sort of pharmacodynamic companion diagnostic, then it would be really interesting to, so like I had a phone call with a guy from Gilead Pharmaceuticals who was like, if you could do this, that would be, we would definitely want to use your thing, but we couldn't. so again, it's like, just kept getting caught in these loops. I think also kind of on the theme of women inventors and women involved in startups, early on, I don't know how to process some of the experiences that I had. Like there's a funding group, I can't remember what they're called, but they were associated with Purdue University. And they were like this team of folks who would interview and decide if they were going to invest in Purdue technologies. I had the weirdest experience pitching to them, where I actually didn't get too weedy. Like I had a pretty clear high level explanation, and I described it to them, and ultimately they were just like, I don't really know if she doesn't seem like she really has expertise in this area, and like she would really understand what the commercialization would be. So, and then like 2 years later, groups like that did fund my male grad student who didn't really understand the technology very well at all. So there were just these weird, and I hesitate with the processing because I'm like, was that just because I didn't do a good enough job of pitching it to them? Or does it all come back to these things of like, they hear it from me and they're like, well, we don't believe women when they say things. But then they heard it from him and he was like, yeah, I'm a really convincing young up and coming scientist guy. Like, yeah. So overall, that's kind of the big picture of what we experienced. And right now, then the student got a NIH I-Corps fellowship. So he went and did the I-Corps program, learned so much. It was amazing. But he also then got a job offer and took that job and moved on into other things. And so the company is like, exists on paper, but is like on ice right now, not doing anything. And I'm hesitant to try to push it. I don't have the time and capacity. I need another person who would really do that. And then I also think we need to get it to the stage that it should be at. The like, yes, we can test enzyme activity from a blood sample or a tumor biopsy and tell you if that's inhibited or not. Like that's where we would have to be. So that's my long story of kind of how this has all played out for me over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, Laurie, that's a great story. And I want to call out because you said you work with Purdue, and I'm sure you work with the tech transfer office there, and I know you work with the tech transfer office at Minnesota. And so, that's where, again, it's an example of even if you have the resources, it doesn't mean 100% success, but it does mean that you have a partner who can help you and to guide you and give you that support to do things like put together an SBIR or to start a company or to go through an I-Corps program. And I-Corps in particular is something I put in the chat because I think it's really important. And so what I-Corps essentially is it's helping you to learn how to be an innovator. So we're scientists first, right? That's why we have a PhD after our name and not an MBA after our name. But what we also are is people who are curious. We want to help to explore the next thing. That's why we set up experiments. We don't know what the result would be, or it wouldn't be called an experiment. And what I-Corps is essentially an experiment in marketing. And so what that means is that when someone says, I have a technology that would change the world, my next question back to them was, how do you know that? Oh, everybody wants it. Well, who's everyone? Well, you know, I mean, I talked to 3 other people in my department and they all said it was cool. So everybody wants it. So, okay, your department thinks it's cool. Have you looked on Amazon to see if it already exists? Maybe your, supplier just isn't buying it for you. And so what iCore essentially does is it teaches you to do things like customer discovery and market assessment. And it encourages you to look outside of your little academic bubble and to see into the broader world, if that's something that people really want, or it might be, in Dr. Parker's case, right, that it needs a little bit more de-risking first. And we talk about words like de-risking or technology readiness level. But essentially what that all means is it market ready? Is it something that can go towards an end user? Or is it something that maybe you need to get some more funds and do a little more research in the lab first? And even if you think it's market ready, that's why you test it out, right? So you do a little bit of a pilot and you say, hey, does this company like this? If not, can you tell me why you don't like it? What can we do to get this technology really to the point where it helps the people around us? And Helen, I think at this point, I'm going to kind of throw it to you because your company has done that recently, right, with this new drug. So what have you done to de-risk, and how do you recommend people do that when they're moving that from an academic to industry perspective?
I think it's a very great question. I think it depends on what you are doing in academia. I think based on my experiences, for most people who are like already professors in academia, they have to run a lab, they have to teach. Usually, I think the most like the successful model I found is they find a partner who is willing to help them commercialize their technology. Either they're trainees or somebody who is willing to invest, or a business, somebody who has a business background, who has a bandwidth to start a company with this technology. I think for my husband is a professor in academia. I know that it's even just with all the research, there's already too much on their plate, let alone running a company. I have known people who professors who, with all good intentions, started out a company even with some partners, and then eventually they have to give up control simply because they just don't have the bandwidth. So I think as an inventor, you have to think, if you really want to focus on commercializing a product, you might have to make a choice. I have known people who have left academia, just pursue their company, their technology, to commercialize something. I have known people who have given or licensed out the technology to somebody else, who founders. They become founders of a company. They can be involved at various degrees. Some have more involvement than others. I think it all depends on what your goal is. If your goal is really to bring something to the market, and you want to have a big say in it, you have to do it more or less yourself. You have to really devote yourself to do it. But if you don't have that bandwidth and you still want to be in academia, then I think the best situation is to find a partner. But you also have to give up some control. So it's a choice. It's a choice, and it depends on what's most valuable to you, what your goal in life is. So I think, that would be my take on it.
Great. So going off of that, there were a few questions that were asked for the registration form. And one of them was, what are you most interested about when it comes to starting or working for a startup? And a common response is, what is the effort to success ratio? What are the probabilities of success? And I realize that's a very, very broad question, and there's a million different answers, but any insights that you have on that for any of you would be great to hear.
I can take a stab at that. I think it might be different for a different person. I think for me, my experience of working at a startup company for over 10 years is, I think the biggest advantage is you really get to do a lot of different things. I used to work at a big biotech. In bigger company, you usually work on like very small piece of a project. For example, I was working at Genentech. I was developing antibody-based therapeutics. So I was working in the research department. I did a lot of preclinical studies on animals. And then eventually, after I left, I think that, our team filed, continue on with that project and filed NDA with the FDA. So, but when I was there, I was just working on that very, very small piece of a project. But in this small company, working at C2N, a couple of years after I went there, we licensed an antibody from Washington University, from one of our founders of our company. And it's an antibody that potentially could be very useful in therapeutics in neurodegenerative diseases. So we took a mouse antibody and we did humanization. We did a lot of preclinical studies and tox studies and manufacturers. And then eventually we took it into people. Our company sponsored the phase 1 clinical trial before we licensed it to another big pharmaceutical company. So during those few years, I was able to work from sort of a start to finish, work on the whole thing of this antibody therapeutics project. I think that's just priceless, right? How often do you get to work, start from a murine antibody, take it all the way to people? I think that the perspective and the experience you gain on those projects are something probably not likely to happen if you work in a big and more established company. So I think the opportunities at startup companies that has really a big appeal for me. There are pros and cons. It's not like all good in a startup or bad in the corporate world. There's good and pros and cons, and also depends on how many risks you can take. And I think that answer to that question is also different when you're at different stage of your life. So I think it's really a personalized situation, but you just need to know what to expect and what you want. That's my answer.
Yeah, and to kind of chime on with what Helen was saying, it is true that starting a company is high risk, and most of the time not successful. So most startup companies will fail within the first 5 years. But one of the things that can make the difference is, de-risking your technology as much as you can before it goes into the company. Really understanding your market, understanding your consumers and what their needs are. And also passion and interest and engagement. So, whether you're coming out of industry, you're coming out of academia, you're coming out on your own, if you don't put in the time and the effort, and I'm sure that, Laurie can speak to this, but it's hours every week that you need to be putting together into this. And it's not so much a matter of here and there, but all the time. So this is a job. And oftentimes universities have something called entrepreneurial leave. And if you don't have that, I highly recommend asking why you don't have that, because it allows you to basically make it your full-time job for 6 months or for a year so that you can put the effort in. Another reason that startups will fail is because it's just not the right time for that technology. So in 2006 or so, a lot of people were working on genomic editing. A lot of people were working on next-gen sequencing. And guess where it went? Nowhere. Not because they had bad science, but because the market just wasn't ready for it yet. And that unfortunately clashes with a patent life. So in most countries around the world, a patent is good for 20 years. And after that, it opens up to everyone. And so you have this timeline. And so one of the things that we see in industry that we don't see in academia is that you don't file a patent until you know it's market ready. But in academia, you have to publish. You have students who want to present. You have to get it out the door. And so really, as long as you can hold on to it as much as you can to de-risk it in your lab before it gets out there, the better chance it has of success. And finding those partners, getting that joint development. A lot of times people it's their baby, right? So this is a thing you've worked on. This is what you put your sweat and tears and blood into. But you have to let go. You have to find that partner. You have to find someone else who can help you to take it out. And the more flexible you are with that, the faster it can get out.
You know, that brings up a really good point that, you know, one of the huge barriers for us was funding. So funding to de-risk it. We had our NIH funding, which is always like this boom and bust situation. It's like constant impractical cycle of actually getting long-term things accomplished. And that panel I stood up in front of and tried to explain this technology to was one of those kind of like de-risk technology, institutional, angel-y type things. And they were just like, so like, I think there's not enough, first of all, there's not enough of that being made available to the kind of stuff that is happening at universities. I think there's probably so much of it in Silicon Valley, but there's just not a whole lot of it coming to universities. And what there is that's coming to universities, if we looked at the data, I'd be willing to throw my hunch that it is not as often going to women and people of color and underrepresented scientists, because it's kind of that same cycle of in-group going on for that too. So there's these big challenges with like, how you have this cool thing, you know, should be able to do something, but it's going to take a lot of money to find out if it can, right? Because you need at least a few full-time people to work on it. And you need the supplies and expenses to work on it. And that's like right there, that's a good $200,000 a year, right? So these little tiny, here's $20,000, that doesn't really help you do that. Like that's a big barrier on getting this stuff figured out.
So we've had some great questions in the chat here. Hopefully you all are reading those. I've been trying to answer them, but I do encourage anybody, please raise your hand or just unmute and ask a question if you have one. You know, one of the things that I think is key too is that nobody's journey is going to be the same. So you're hearing from Dr. Parker and what her journey was and her experience with her technology in this moment in time. But everybody's going to have a different experience. And that's not a bad thing either. What we can do is learn from each other, find a mentor, find someone who's been there, done that. And I'm going to volunteer, Dr. Parker, as one of those mentors, because you don't have to be perfect to be a mentor. You just have to kind of have been around the block. You have just a little bit more experience than the person asking you the questions.
And I have reviewed SBIR grants quite a lot as well. So at least in that realm, I can help with advice.
And actually, you know, Laurie, that's a great point. So the SBIR grants, there are 11 institutions in the federal government that offer these grant opportunities. And they range from around $100,000 to $250,000. And you know what? They're always looking for reviewers. So if you want to learn how to write a grant, the best thing you can do is go review a grant. So if you are interested in this, again, DOD, NIH, NSF, USDA, EPA, everybody's offering these, and they're usually on a 6-month rotation cycle. They don't take up that much work, especially if you actually want a startup and you think that an SBIR review takes too much work, you're probably not ready for a startup. So go connect with the program managers, let them know you want to review these grants and give yourself that opportunity and experience to learn before it's your turn. All right, Marissa, you have your hand up.
Hi, Megan. Thanks so much for your talk. I asked a question in the chat about kind of the difference between the inventor and the big ideas person and the hands-on person. How do you know like how much you have a claim to when it comes to a patent or like the commercialization of something as someone that's like worked on a project or something like that?
Yeah, great. And I did answer this in the chat, but I think it's an important point that you raised, and I want to reiterate it. So number one, you are the big glue on campus. You brought in a $10 million NIH grant. Are you an inventor? No. But you brought in $10 million. Cool. but all you did was write the grant? No. Are you the undergraduate student who went in and followed the SOP? And you followed it word for word for word for word. Are you an inventor? No. Are you the third year PhD student who took the money, created the protocol, put in 40 hours a day in the lab? Yeah, you're the inventor. So the inventor is someone who can actually point at the creation of something and say, yes, I did that. I am signing my name to this claim. This novel, non-obvious invention came from my head. So an inventor is a very specific definition by the USPTO. You actually have to sign a document when you submit a patent that says that you are an inventor. If your inventors are left off of a patent, you can invalidate your patent. It's a very strict definition. When it comes to other forms of intellectual property, there are also definitions. For example, with a copyright, you have to be a creator. I will actually have my inventors work through their document and write their initials down next to the sections that they worked on. If I don't see your initials on that page, you're not a creator. It's not your copyright. It doesn't matter if it was your idea. It doesn't matter if you went through and edited it for grammatical mistakes. It doesn't matter if you copy and pasted from 3 different documents and put them onto one page together. So there are some pretty strict definitions, and that's where it comes in important. Actually, you have your hand raised.
You caught my ear there when you're talking about who's the inventor, because in doing some research for my own patent and just, in science in general, I've seen so many patents that had lots and lots and lots of authors listed as inventors. So that seems, that's what you said just strikes me as the opposite of what's common. The PI always is on there.
Right, and that's something that is so hard for academics especially, right? So I'm the author on the paper, I'm the PI of the grant. So clearly I'm important. You can't leave me off of this patent. But that's, again, that conversation. Just because you're on the paper doesn't make you an inventor. It doesn't mean you can't be on the paper either. And I encourage my inventors to do that oftentimes. I say, hey, don't leave your undergrad off that paper. It's a fantastic thing for them. It's a great opportunity to further their career, but I'm not putting them on as an inventor on the patent. I had to have a conversation one time. Well, what did you do? Well, I'm the chair of the department. Yeah, but what did you do? Well, I'm the chair. I approved all the grants that came through. And so it was an argument. And ultimately, it was detrimental to the actual inventor. She was a female faculty member going up for tenure, and her chair was like, I'm not going to approve the fact that you're working with the tech transfer office unless I get to be on your patent. And so that's when your tech transfer office fights for you.
Yeah, I can sort of describe some of the examples of this. And so there's ways that even the PI can still be an inventor. So like for the example of our algorithm, that came about through these conversations between me and the grad student, where I would be like, hey, I have an idea, we should do this. And he'd say, okay, here's a way I think it could be done. And I'd say, no, you should try this. And then he'd say, no, I want to try this. So that through that exchange process of us working it out together, we did both contribute to the ultimate design of how it worked. So there are certainly like ways that people who were involved in that part of the design are still inventors, but it's just not default, right? And I think that's I've seen examples of that exact same thing too, of like the sort of default assumption that for example, and this is very frustrating to me, I will never, well, and now the patent is, no, it's granted now, but we have a patent where a collaborator worked on it with us, and he was a senior professor and I was a junior person at the time, and he literally didn't understand any of it. Like we had a meeting once where the grad student was showing the data and talking about what she saw, and he was like, and so it's that the ATP molecules just gather around this area in the cell, and then this is what you see in the image. I was like, that is definitely not what is happening in this technology. But yet, the way the politics worked out, I mean, this patent could just be invalidated because he did not know. He was probably not an inventor on this thing at all. He did not understand how it worked. And it was me and the grad student who were the ones who actually like made it happen. So yes, there are lots of ways that can play out that sometimes you really have to fight against.
Okay, well, it looks like we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I do want to make sure that we have some time for everyone to do a little bit of networking if you're able to stay on. But a huge thank you to our panelists, and if there are any final questions that didn't get answered, please take the time to unmute yourself very quickly. And if not, again, thank you, Megan, Laurie, and Helen. Your insight has been really, really interesting and valuable for all of us to learn from. And we really appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Awesome. Yeah. So let's give everybody a huge round of applause, and especially Susan for organizing this amazing workshop or panel. I think this was so informative. I think people are going to, if they weren't able to join, I know July is a hard month for people to join because of family vacations. We'll have this recording and be able to send that to others. So we'll make sure to post that on Twitter. But I learned so much, and I really appreciate all the insight you guys were able to give. And I saw you guys put all your contact info in the chat. So anybody that would like to contact each of our panelists directly, please grab that contact info, and I'll also keep a copy of the chat in case anybody needs that for later on. But after a huge round of applause to everybody else, are there any announcements for our FeMS group that anybody would like to unmute themselves and make? I know there were ASMS registration is already over, or abstract submission is already over. I don't know if Amber's still on here, but is MSACL Europe still open, Amber, or did that just close too? I can't remember.
I think I saw it on Twitter as it opened, but Mana also is opening up for abstracts as well.
Perfect. Thanks for the reminder, because there's so much stuff going on right now. It's easy to miss things. And yeah, I was thinking MSACL's open. I know my student submitted their abstract last week, but they were doing better than I usually do. So they're always one step ahead of me. Go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, MSACL, the deadline closed for submissions. The podium closed a while ago, and the poster deadline closed last Friday.
Okay.
And we announced who's gonna speak when on the 31st of this month, in 10 days. Yeah.
Awesome.
But I guess, I mean, if someone has like a super urgent, super new something they want to post, you can always try to squeeze it in.
One more thing I wanted to offer is that the US HUPO Early Career Researcher Group is having a startups and entrepreneurship panel as well. That's coming. I can't remember the exact date, but if anybody needs it, let me know. You can email me. But that will have my grad student on it.
Oh, yay.
The one who actually did all that. So you could hear both sides, both ends of this experience.
That's awesome. Yeah, so definitely something to hit. We also have the International Lipidomics Society. For anybody out there interested in lipids, let's see, that conference is going to be the end of October or middle of October. So guys, please check that out if you're interested in some of the new upcoming stuff in lipids. But other than that, anybody that's available to stay around, we'll move to breakout rooms now, and you guys can stay in your breakout rooms as long as you want. Sometimes people can only stay 5 minutes, sometimes they can stay an hour. I'm just going to leave them open, and you guys just go ahead and log off when you're done. And so if you have a great conversation going on in the breakout rooms, feel free to stay on. I'm not going to have any end. Hi, Anne.
Erin, we have I just remember you and I, we have a talk on tomorrow where people are invited, of course.
Oh,
The co-host. Is it tomorrow?
Yeah, it
right?
is tomorrow. I totally forgot about that too.
So you, me, and John and a few others from FeMS are talking tomorrow at a symposium co-organized by sort of the Chinese equivalent of MSACL. It's called instrument.com.cn, and Hui, who is part of our FeMS board, she co-organized that together with like that organization and FeMS. So lots of FeMS founders, board members, supporters, and so on are speaking at this first virtual symposium on it's tomorrow about this time. And I think you can sign up via. And we put it on Twitter. No, it's on. I think it's also on our website.
Yep, yeah, and Maggie just put the link in the chat. So anybody that's interested, they asked us to do a little bit on science, or like I think we're supposed to speak 25 minutes or something, and so we're supposed to do about 15-18 minutes on science and then 10 minutes on advice. So if you guys want some crazy advice from Anne and I, you can pop on there. But it should be really funny for US people. I think on East Coast time it starts about 8 p.m. Eastern, and for Anne it is in the morning. So. But yeah, we would love to have anybody come join us out. But if nothing else, let's huge round of applause, and I'm going to start breaking you guys out into breakout groups. So if you're not available to come, go ahead and log off, and I'll just break everybody out who needs to be broke out. But thank you again. Huge round of applause to everybody today. That was awesome.